Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kenyatta Grant. Thank you all for joining us for the Advocacy of Color Network under the West Virginia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, our webinar for today called Evolving Racism, where our facilitator, Charlie Mullins, will step us through a very informative and provocative webinar. So please feel free to be engaged as he goes through the information that he presented today. Please also sign in on the chat so we can make sure that you can all be accounted for. And I'm trying to think if there's any other logistics we need to go over. Just a FYI, this is being recorded, just to let everyone know. And we'll go ahead and get started. Did I forget anything else?
No, but we do have a housekeeping slide right after this one where we'll be talking about more stuff.
Okay, well, Charlie, why don't you go ahead and get started so we can make sure that we start on time, and I'll keep admitting people as you go ahead and do your welcome.
Sure thing. So as Kenyatta said, this is Evolving Racism. I'm Charlie Mullins. I'm the programs coordinator for WV Free and a co-chair for Advocates of Color Network. Today, we're going to be taking a look at racial injustice throughout history. And at the same time, you'll also hopefully be recognizing how the racism of previous generations builds on future racism and inspires new forms of racism through the echoes of the legacies of the past. Before we really dive into that, though, let's go over a little bit of housekeeping. Remember, one person, one mic at a time, one voice at a time. If you want to comment on something or ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself, but let's try to have only one voice happening at a time, partially so we can reduce background noise during the recording, but also so that we are not speaking over each other. Be curious, open, and respectful. Remember to call in, not call out. And at the same time, remember that no one knows everything. Together, we all know a lot. There's a lot of information here, and no one is the arbiter of all of it. Also remember to take space or make space. If you're usually quiet, challenge yourself to put yourself out there and take more space to let your voice be heard. But on the opposite side of that, if you usually talk a lot, be mindful to leave room for quieter voices in the room so that other people can have their voice heard. Remember too, to speak from your own experience. Try using I phrases and referring to your own lived experiences rather than generalization. And remember to take care of yourself during this. Part of what we're going to be talking about may be traumatic for some people, so if you feel the need to step away, please feel free to do so. Also, before we really dive in, I want to share with you this quote from Deneen, who co-hosted the previous webinar. Deneen, which is this quote, "You can't dismantle what you think doesn't exist." Deneen said this while we were originally planning these webinars, and it really struck me. And I wanted to share it in this context because it's very true when we think about how so much of racism's history is either ignored or just plain unknown. And it's impossible to truly grapple with racial injustice if we aren't fully aware of how it's taken shape. So let's start with the concept of evolution itself. What do you think of when you think of the word evolution? Go ahead and type your answer into the chat, and there's really no wrong answers here. It could be biology, it could be Darwin, it could be monkeys, whatever comes to your mind. For example, as you could probably tell by the image on the screen, for me personally, I always think about the X-Men when I think of this word. So what do you think of when you think of evolution?
Charlie, as they come up, do you want us to bring them to your attention, or did you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Someone put biology class. Another person put evolution equals change due to environment. We have change, a period of growth over a period of time. We have another change, and then we have changing, another change, ever changing, and transition so far.
Ooh, I like transition. That's really good. So I want you all to kind of keep these in your mind as we go through this webinar, because this is going to be relevant as we look at the evolution throughout history. So next, I want you to ask yourself, what time do you think racial injustice started here? With here being the land of North America that we consider today to be the United States, and time being what time period? It doesn't have to be a specific year. You can just pick a century, like the 1800s, for example, and type it into the chat, or feel free to, again, to unmute yourself and say so.
So we don't have anything right yet, but I'm gonna go ahead and put 1500s. Final answer.
Okay.
Okay, we've got 1800s, 1600s, and 1700.
Okay. So, if there are no further answers, it really starts right from the very beginning with the discovery of the Eastern Seaboard in 1502. European settlers enslaved indigenous people immediately upon discovering the country, starting with the Spanish belief of encomienda, which means the divine right of ownership by conquest, a concept that would immediately be embraced by the white settlers of the many European nations that would make their own settlements and their own slaves. Indigenous men were either enslaved into labor or murdered if they resisted enslavement, and indigenous women were raped regardless of whether they resisted being enslaved or whether they served as labor or as servants. Not long after this, European colonizers waged multiple wars against the many indigenous tribes, committing mass destruction and slavery of indigenous people. Conveniently, the European colonizers kept hardly any records of this, so no exact numbers of just how many indigenous people were killed at this time seem to exist, at least nothing that I could really find. At this same time, the first African slaves arrive here in North America as the servants of ship captains and colony stewards. Is there anything anyone is saying in the chat before we move on to the next century?
Some were just replying on the question you asked previous to the slide, and Belinda Hopkins actually put when men saw a difference in color.
That's really good.
The moment Christopher Columbus stepped foot on this land and when Europeans settled in North America.
Oh, I'm glad that somebody said when Christopher Columbus stepped foot on this land, because that's something we're taught a lot in schools. You know, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and that's when he discovered America. But that is actually objectively untrue. In 1492, Columbus actually landed in the Bahamas, not in North America. And he later landed in Cuba and Jamaica. And in the voyages of later years, he would land in Central America and then later South America, but he died in 1503, a year after North America was landed on, without having ever stepped foot in this country. And again, a lot of people don't realize that, but we celebrate Columbus Day every year for someone who literally has never been in America. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. So moving into the 1600s, the African slave trade is truly established in the North American colonies in 1619, after it had been profitable in Europe, and after indigenous slavery was already pretty well established into colony life by this time. There are originally no laws or legal identities tied into African slavery, and it's really treated as more of a fact of life than anything else, thanks in no small part to the casual attitude towards indigenous slavery. Eventually, though, in 1641, Massachusetts is the very first colony to officially legalize slavery, and most of the colonies do the same very soon after. During this time, the colonies and the European settlers that inhabit them also developed these colonies to be even more intricate, including establishing more laws and territorial claims. Through this, many Native American tribes that also resided in the areas these colonies were established lose their rights to stay on that land. They also lose their autonomy of self-governance, frequently having colonial law forced against them. And they also lose their resources due to colonial overhunting and colonial claiming of natural resources like rivers, for example. And of course, on top of all of that, colonists also continue to commit slavery, rape, and murder against Native Americans to perpetuate systematic control over them. So we're all very familiar with the fact of the African slave trade, but many are less so about indigenous slave trade. And part of this is because the African slave trade would eventually become the norm and indigenous slavery less so. At this point, I want you to type into the chat or unmute yourself and really ask yourself, why do you think the African slave trade eventually overtook the indigenous slave trade?
Okay, Charlie, we don't have anything right now, so maybe people are still typing.
No problem.
Okay, here we go. We do have one response in the chat and it indicates it was more profitable.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
And that's all we have for right now.
All right, well, there are many different answers, but it was more profitable is indeed very true. And really, it's kind of the most basic and true answer, being that African slavery was simply more cost effective. White people were able to make more money through African slavery than they were by waging war against and trying to enslave indigenous people who had villages they could escape to and people who could fight for them here in America, which was something that African slaves did not have. And this is important to remember because when we talk about the oppression of people of color, it's almost always a matter of money, or at least money is always involved. When we talk about the oppression of bodies of color, it's because those bodies are not seen as people, but as profit margins. So moving into the 1700s, the slavery of African Americans is one of the biggest industries in the country, not just as a source of workforce or cash cropping, but also profitable as a trade of human beings themselves, with many getting rich simply by selling or trading slaves. In 1787, the 3/5 Compromise legally declared that African Americans only counted as 3/5 of a person for census counts, which would be the foundation, both legally speaking and culturally speaking, for establishing Black people as less than human. In 1750, slavery of indigenous people is finally made illegal, but such slavery still happens in private homes and private businesses for about another 100 years. And nobody really does anything about it during this time. Again, it's treated more as like a fact of life than anything else. At the same time, colonial expansion and later after 1776, state expansion continues to strip away lands and resources from Native Americans through means both legislative and deviously private. It's at this time that the Yazoo land fraud leads to the elimination of the entire tribe of Yazoo people, and the infamous purposeful spreading of smallpox wipes out 90% of all Native people in America. So at this point, I want you to ask yourself, how do you think all of this informed the creation of the United States? That's maybe a little bit of a redundant question, but I think it's a very important one nonetheless, and one that I'd like you all to grapple with. So feel free again to type into the chat box or to unmute yourself and let us know why you or how you think this all informed the creation of the US.
So we have something in the chat box. It is the foundation of our laws and systems.
Yeah, that's pretty much nail on the head.
Creation of almost all the laws and systems that exist today. That was another response.
Yeah, it's uncanny to think about how all of this kind of acts as the foundation for everything that we've built up. And it's also important to keep in mind that the founding fathers who created this country were very much students of history and scholars of society. So all of these things that we've talked about just now are things they were all aware of.
And Charlie, we have something else. It continued the comfortable systems of the European settlers. And it helped shape our nation's institutions.
Absolutely, yeah. Something I always like to say is that systems exist to perpetuate itself. So saying that it continues the systems of comfortability for European settlers and European slavers and all of these things is very much true because, again, systems exist to propagate themselves and ensure they stay in power. Is there anything else before we move on?
Yes, white men had the power and money that could create the laws they felt fit their needs and cost-effective labor to build our country.
Yes, again, thinking back on the oppression of bodies of color, how it is always a matter of money, profit margins over people's humanity. So now as we move into the history of our first century as a nation, I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. As you might have noticed, this is not a comprehensive history of all the racism that has happened in our country. An hour and 15 minutes is just nowhere near enough time to go over everything. And so as we move into the next centuries, I just want to say that what we're covering is kind of the basics. And I highly encourage you to do more deep diving on your own and find out everything that we just simply did not have enough time to touch on. So what did racism look like in the 1800s? Well, the Homestead Act of 1862 forces Native Americans off their lands and sells it to white homesteaders and railroad companies. Congress also makes it illegal in 1864 for Native Americans to be taught their own language and forces indigenous children to be taught in white boarding schools. And of course, the Trail of Tears happens during this time, which really is its own huge scale of atrocities, and eventually leads to the deaths of 17,000 Native Americans. The US Senate and House also enforced gag rules at this time, preventing any discussion or legislation being brought up related to slavery. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 legally denies any rights or recognition of citizenship to African Americans, further ensuring that they can be victimized without any consequences whatsoever. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 also declares that not only all law enforcement individuals, but all citizens are required to help with the capture of escaping slaves and returning them to their slave owners. Because of this, police departments are suddenly created all over the states after 1850 to enforce the subjugation of Black people, where before 1850, only 2 police departments existed. In the whole country, not just in a state. Most police departments that are created at 1850 or in the years later are actually just advancements of slave patrols that were already in force. The Ku Klux Klan, that is the first Ku Klux Klan, is also created in 1865 to murder free Black people and any politicians who would want to free Black people. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, which granted some liberties to people of color, like equal treatment in public transportation or public accommodations, was also declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, not even 10 years after it was passed. This action would actually be the foundation for the Jim Crow laws and the lynchings that would begin soon after, as you can see in this lynching postcard on the screen. About a decade after that, the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson upholds segregation. And of course, the 13th Amendment is passed after the end of the Civil War, which we all know why that was fought. And the 13th Amendment ends slavery as a public industry and instead makes it a private industry by ensuring that slavery is a punishment for crimes, a systematic option for oppression that is still used today. In 1845, the US annexes Texas, which is the first instance of stealing the land of the Mexican people. This begins the Mexican-American War, where the US killed not only American soldiers, but countless, or not American soldiers, Mexican soldiers, sorry, but also killed countless Mexican civilians across what is now the Southwest US. A wave of murder and destruction that would see that entire area of land eventually surrendered to, or perhaps more accurately stolen by, the US government. At this same time, the US government also annexes many Caribbean and Pacific Island countries, including Hawaii and Puerto Rico, using the military to either overtake or just straight up kill the populations of those islands. And Chinese immigrants are recruited into constructing the Transcontinental Railroad and forced to work under inhumanly awful conditions that cost somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 deaths. A little over a decade after the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, the US government then bans any and all Chinese people from entering the country for the next 10 years. So, thinking about all of that, I want you to ask yourself, how does a century of injustice, such as our first century as a nation, influence a future century? Again, go ahead and type into the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself and let us know how you think that is.
I just want to make a comment that you gave me some understanding. I never knew why, or really understand why, the police force was so easy to kill Black people. Why they was so, and even after all these trainings and even after all this publicity, even from Rodney King, I remember over 20 something years ago when we start filming it, because when we start filming it, that's when we started getting attention. But now that you just have coded what was the seed and the spirit of the police department, it actually makes sense. And I don't think they even know. So just thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you recall earlier when I was saying that many police departments started after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, where there was only 2 that existed before, this was actually something I was going to talk about in the very first draft of this presentation. But the very first police department that was ever created in the United States was the Boston Police Department in 1835. And the reason why this was created in 1835 was that in the same year of 1835, Congress and the House of Representatives passed the second gag rule preventing the discussion of slavery in the House. And this itself was a reaction to the Boston riots of 1833, I want to say. I might be wrong on that date, which was a riot throughout the city against abolitionists and anti-racists who were against the enslaving of Black people, an industry that had really built up Boston. When people think about Boston and Massachusetts, many people think about its abolitionist history, but really, again, Massachusetts was the first state to officially legalize slavery, and Boston, being a harbor town, was one of the biggest ports of slavery at the time. So really, right from the very beginning, before 1850, the police started because of slavery.
Charlie, we have some things going on in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry, Stephanie.
No. I was just going to read them, but take it away.
Darian writes here, history repeats itself, so it continued, unfortunately, until someone made a move to stop or change it. Another comment, my mind is blown in 25 minutes. This has been impactful. Another comment, it enables it and allows it to continue. It causes people to believe that that is how it has always been, and they justify it. Oh, and there's another one. Oh gosh, there's a couple of them. Okay. The injustice has been made quote unquote normal in the past, and it is a slow process to change people's thought patterns and change institutional racism, sexism, etc. And Darren agreed. So much history I didn't know. A really great read on the history of policing in the United States. Oh, sorry, just shifted. If people have time to dive into some of the great points on how police departments developed. And so Molly, if you look in the chat, Molly has left a link to click on a link for policing in the United States, part 1. Okay, so I think
I'm not sure which Molly that is, but if it's the Molly I'm thinking of, please shoot me that on Facebook or in an email. I would love to have that resource.
it is Molly Kennedy, and I will copy and paste it, and I'll send that to you, Charlie, so you can, so it won't sidetrack you. And then there's another comment. It sets up an imbalance of power for future generations of people of color. They are unable to build wealth and prosperity because power and finances have been taken from them. And that's the last comment at this point in time.
Excellent. These are all wonderful answers, and they're all entirely true. And something else I want you to think of in the context of this question is the image that you're seeing before you right now. What you're seeing on the screen is a painting from 1872 called American Progress by an artist named John Gast. And it's supposed to be depicting the beauty of American expansion. As you can see here on the left, sorry if it's like too small on your screen, it depicts Native Americans being driven from their lands, which, as you can see in the middle, is making way for the wagon train era of settling and farmlanding, which, as you can see on the right, is making way for the era of railroads. And if you can see it there in the top right, eventually the era of urban development of cities. Above all of this is an angel, which is supposed to signify the divine purpose and beauty of all of this. I chose this painting because I want you to think of what this reminds you of. For me, it reminds me exactly of encomienda, the divine right of ownership by conquest. 300 years after that concept is introduced to this country, that ideal is present here, both in this painting, in this cultural ideology, and as well in effect in the country at this time. And this acts as the basis for the next century or centuries soon to come. And the whole point behind this that I kind of want you to walk away with is that the injustices of the past inform the injustices of the future, and they create the justification for future injustices that we refer to traditionally, or that we tend to refer to as tradition or as progress. So moving into the 1900s, the century in which most of us were born, we see the founding of the second Ku Klux Klan that we still see active today. By 1910, the prison pipeline system has exploded, quadrupling in size compared to 3 decades ago. The US government also forces Japanese people into concentration camps during World War II. And of course, the civil rights movement sees all kinds of opposition, both from the public and from the government. During the 1970s and 1980s, there was the war on drugs and the 1994 crime bill, both of which criminalized countless people of color and expands the prison pipeline system that was already out of control. During the 1960s and 1970s, government doctors working on Native American reservations secretly undergo forced sterilization of indigenous women and girls as young as 11 years old. Think about that for a moment. That's not only deeply traumatizing to children, but that's effectively wiping out generations of the future. And of course, let's not forget the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, in which white people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, many if not most of whom were members of the KKK, kill Black citizens of the town, rob Black communities, and burn down businesses in those communities, and eventually used private planes to drop bombs on the town, an event that would cause the deaths of 300 people, most of whom were Black, injure 800 more, again, most of whom were Black, and leave about 1,000 Black people homeless due to the destruction of 35 city blocks by bombs and fires. This would quickly have the truth behind it, altered by official reports influenced by KKK members who had control in the town, and it is still arguably the worst domestic terrorism event in US history, almost doubling the destructive toll of what is typically considered the worst, which is the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. In the past 20 years, we've had rampant Islamophobia and violence against Middle Easterners after 9/11. We've also had the systematic killing and abuse of Black people and the opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement that has risen in response of it. We've also had anti-Asian abuse, mistreatment, and murder surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. Latina and Hispanic immigrants are forced into cages and horrendous conditions, with many Latina and Hispanic people who were already citizens in this country being deported from the country through targeted tactics and governmental lying. And Native people continue to suffer threats in these past 20 years against their homes and resources by the government, suffer sex abuse in these past 20 years at a 2.5 times higher likelihood than any other demographic. And the disappearances of their women and girls not only continues on in these past 20 years, but has risen to what it was before. And just in case you all thought we would be done in 2020, let's talk a little bit about history in the making. We all know about the Capitol riot and the Confederate flags and the Camp Auschwitz sweater. I've practiced this like 15 times and I always trip up on that, sorry. The Camp Auschwitz sweater by now. And maybe most of you have also heard about the surge of violence against Asian people in our country in just these past 2 months. We've also had some of Washington, D.C.'s white officers in a lawsuit for racial discrimination, including referring to their own Black colleagues by the police code for suspicious persons. We've also had a US district judge just recently decide that land belonging to the Apache people could be legally stolen because, to quote this judge, the United States can extinguish Indian title by treaty or by sword, basically confirming that the US government can still kill indigenous people to take their land if it wants to. And Latina people are still in cages, and the new administration is still supporting ICE. Now, you might be wondering, why haven't you heard of some of these things, or maybe even most of these things? The answer to that is design. Design by a government and a culture that adheres to a system of white supremacy that benefits the people of that system. Design that's structured to ensure that you are blocked off from this knowledge, or that this knowledge is lost to time, or that you are given the incorrect perception of how things were or are. Think to yourself and type in the chat or unmute yourself and share what designs you think are in place that try to either keep you from knowing these things or from seeing things differently. For those of you here in West Virginia, what designs in our state do you see?
School curriculum.
Absolutely. I could not agree more.
We have in the chat, West Virginia is still culturally isolated. People in power write or rewrite the history we learn. In a state with West Virginia history, we don't learn about lynching or slavery in the state, and we are taught a narrative of West Virginia as the good guys, somewhat separate. And then some, oh, this is going extremely fast. Military bases named after Confederate officers, and then lack of being taught in schools. I just read recently somewhere that the Tulsa race massacre has just this year been passed to be taught in Oklahoma schools.
Yeah, that was a great point. I'm not sure who said that about schools teaching West Virginia history and how we don't often learn about lynching or slavery in the state. And we're taught this narrative of West Virginia is the good guys. Something else also to consider is if by chance we are taught in West Virginia schools about slavery, it's oftentimes through a very altered perception of it. This was something else I was also going to talk about in the original draft of this. But before I had the job I had now, I was a teacher in West Virginia schools. And I would oftentimes see lesson plans talking about how John Brown and the attack on Harper's Ferry to free slaves at Harper's Ferry was an act of domestic terrorism. And it's wild to me that here in the state of West Virginia, the only state, by the way, in the history of the United States that became a state out of opposition to the Confederacy, that we're teaching the idea that freeing enslaved Black people is an act of domestic terrorism. It's absurd to me. I'm not sure who mentioned about the Tulsa race massacre being taught in school, Oklahoma schools finally, which is great, but also something to consider about that, which I only found out while doing research recently into it, is that the numbers I was talking about earlier, the 300 dead, the 1,000 left homeless, these numbers are only given to us because of a study done into the Tulsa race massacre in 2003 or 2004. I'm not sure which one. And those are decades, almost a century after it happened. And it's having to look past records that, again, were manipulated by members of the KKK who were in control of the town. We're trying to build truth and look at racial history through blockades of white supremacy. And I think that's something we constantly have to be vigilant about. Was there anything in the chat? Sorry, I keep going on tangents about stuff I keep thinking about.
Yeah, there's quite a few things in the chat. Okay, let me, let's see here. Okay, military bases named after Confederate officers. And then another comment, lack of being taught in schools. I just read recently somewhere that the Tulsa race massacre has just, oh, I think, did you already read that one, Stephanie? I'm sorry if you did, I'm sorry. Oh,
It's okay.
Oh, okay. I think it was starting with Jennifer. Jennifer got, everyone wants to keep their heroes and will push down narrative that seeks to change it. There are 2 bills in the legislature forbidding the teaching of divisive concepts, directing the attention of the people to other issues. And someone is just agreeing with Margaret who put that in the chat, that is infuriating about the divisive concepts. And then Tina mentioned here about the censorship. For example, just hold on, when some just popped away there. Okay, in a county in West Virginia, the parents are trying to ban books such as The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas in schools. Lots of historical figures have been sugar-coated. Our founding fathers were crummy people too. And someone's agreeing with Tina in terms of trying to censor The Hate You Give. Keep an eye on the outrage at the idea that students should read The Hate You Give. Blatant committed racism.
Yeah. Yeah, I especially like that someone brought up the Hate You Give stuff, because that itself is a pure example of systematic and designed white supremacy trying to block progress and information being put forth by people of color, especially when we see people talking about how so much better it is that the replacement for The Hate You Give was Romeo and Juliet. Again, before I had this job, I was a teacher. I've taught Romeo and Juliet multiple times. People complaining that The Hate You Give shouldn't be taught in schools because there's swearing and sex and substance use have never read Romeo and Juliet, okay? It's literally a story about kids engaging in sex, drinking and swearing, and then later on deciding to commit suicide because their parents are trying to tell them what to do. This is not an opposition to I guess what some people would call graphic content in curriculum in schools. This is an opposition to racial justice. So it's time to think once again on evolution. How does everything we've talked about apply to the concept of evolution? How do we see racism in the context of evolution in our country? How does racism use evolution, to propagate itself? You can type in the chat box or unmute yourself to talk a little bit about this if you want. But really, I want you to kind of settle in with this question. I want you to take it in. Instead of putting your voice out there and bringing the answer out through your voice, I want you to take it into your heart and really think about how evolution ties into this history of racial injustice and how evolution ties into how we must react to this history of racial injustice. And while you think about this, I just kind of want to tell you my own thoughts and my own perspective on how evolution applies to all of this. Evolution is not simply the changing or adapting of an organism to its environment. It is the improving of that organism to make it stronger and more efficient. Just as this is true in the biological sense of evolution, so too is it true for the evolution of racial inequity and injustice. As such, our words and our efforts and mindsets against racism cannot simply adapt to the current times. They must also evolve. Much like a virus will evolve to be stronger and more resilient against antibodies, so too will racism evolve to be stronger and more resilient against static resistance to that racism. The only solution to combating racism with generations worth of strength, of evolved strength, is to continuously evolve the strength of our own anti-racism. So, with that said, and with all of this in mind, are there any questions? Again, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. First, I want to say thank you, because with knowledge, there's power. So I thank you for this information. And not only for this information, I thank you for confirming what I intuitively knew. Because one thing I know about this system, and what I tell individuals, if you live in an apartment and your bathroom is upstairs and Aunt Sally comes to live with you and Aunt Sally has a wheelchair, no matter how nice you are for Aunt Sally cannot live in your house because your bathroom is upstairs. And even though you can operate in that space, Aunt Sally can't. And I always tell these nice, good-hearted people that always try to convince me to do these projects and programs and things that they continue to do that's not transformative or healing for our people. And you gave us all that history about all the oppression, how it was structured, but I'm sure there's no history that combat that, or that gave reparations to that, or addressed that. But they still want to continue to employ us in a system that we have to work because we got to pay our bills, but yet bound to do the real work that we really need to free and heal our people. So I hope, I see this is recorded. Thank you very much. And I don't know what place this is going to be shared, but I hope that is shared and we all take this, because I think you articulate what a lot of us may have wanted to articulate and may not know how. So thank you, and I appreciate this.
I have a question. I'm still baffled on the Christopher Columbus piece. What is our premise for celebrating Christopher Columbus?
Simply put, white supremacy. I suppose if we wanted to try to be fair about this, part of it is due to how history is written by white supremacists and by the victors who are themselves white supremacists. And so many of us are kind of born into this knowledge. We're born into a system that propagates this idea of, teaching early on in schools that Christopher Columbus is the one who discovered America, in 1492. That's why we celebrate him, all that stuff. So part of it is simply the systematic nature, but part of it is also the idea of confirming that white ideology and white achievement is really the basis for this entire country. Just even in saying the concept that Columbus, quote unquote, discovered America, he didn't discover anything. I was going to say something else, but because we're recording this, I don't want to swear. He didn't discover anything. People were already here. This land already existed, but we say he discovered it because we want to propagate the idea of white achievement as the basis for this entire country's existence. And so that's why we also put forth and propagate these lies, such as saying he landed here in 1492 when he never even stepped foot here and died a year after people did step foot here from Europe. And honestly, I really think part of it goes down to the idea also in the United States of America that we have of traditionalism. Here in West Virginia, this is certainly something we're deeply mired in, but I think this is also true for the country as a whole, where we like to believe in these old classical ideas of championship, of iconography, especially after World War II, of the idea of Americans being heroes. And when we think of things like people sailing across the ocean and discovering new things, there's a certain idyllic, heroic, and romantic nature to it. And because we're inclined, culturally speaking, towards these historic and romantic and idyllic things within American culture, we implicitly support these racist ideologies, even if we don't really understand that we're doing so. And really, something else that I think is also very important to remember is that many people historically, but also especially nowadays, who are avowed white supremacists and neo-Nazis, people like Richard Spencer and what have you, they love to propagate these ideas of white European exceptionalism. White Europeans discovered this country, white Europeans built up this country, when really white Europeans just kind of sat around and watched people of color do everything. And I think that's also something we need to be very vigilant and actively combative towards, is this idea of white exceptionalism as the basis for everything in this country.
Like, I stand firm on all of that. Like, where I'm at is the fact that he didn't step foot here, because I've never heard that at all. Like that threw me the whole talk today, because I've never ever heard that. I learned that today, because I believe, I stand upon everything you just said, and I teach that everywhere I go, but I have never heard that. So I thank you for that. And from this day forward, I'm going to research that and I will teach that. So I thank you for that.
You're very welcome. And yes, that's something that, we are never taught in schools. I actually was a history minor because I just really love history in college. And even in college, I was taught the whole 1492 thing. And it's pervasive throughout the whole education system. I never knew this until years and years ago when I did my own research. So again, much like how I was talking about with how everything we've covered today is very, very much the basics, and I really encourage you to do deep diving. I just want to echo that and really do the research yourself and just really look into everything that we didn't have time to cover today, because there is so much out there that we are blockaded from, and that is kept hidden from us. And a huge part, at least I feel personally, of racial injustice is discovering the truth of our heritage and building up from that.
just to reflect, there's a lot of things going on in the chat. And I think, Anitra, to what you were referring to, and not for the first time hearing about Christopher Columbus not setting foot here in North America, just to put your mind at ease, there was a lot of people in the chat agreeing with you that this was their first time that they were hearing it too. So in terms of the history lesson that we all got today is just absolutely priceless in terms of when you know more, you can do more, the acknowledgement, and just really sitting down and knowing that there is so much more that we don't know when it comes down to history, because we've already established that history is very whitewashed. So I just want to kind of just address what's going on in the chat in terms of you're not the only one. I think we all have had a lot of aha moments thanks to Charlie and him laying this out in a way that we were able to take snippets and things that we can think about as we continue to move forward, so we can learn more and not just debunking the myths of racism, but looking at the evolution and how this is continuing to progress and how we still see a lot of these things happen today. So Charlie, thank you.
Absolutely. And if there's no other questions or anything anyone else wants to say, I just kind of want to progress forward and say that all this history is very much leading up to stuff we're going to be talking about how to confront and look into this kind of stuff. And in our next webinar, we're going to be talking about the trauma that so much of this history has built into and how to properly address that trauma. And at the same time, I wanted to leave you all with this list of resources. Again, this webinar is being recorded, so you can see this in recording, but if you want to go ahead and take a picture of this with your phone, feel free. But this is just a list of resources and things to read and things to watch that we all put together that we feel is very significant in re-educating on this history or looking at current experiences in, I guess, what I like to call the making of history.
And just so you know, so Charlie is part of our Advocacy of Color Network, which we are a group under the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, where we focus on cultural accountability. And this is something new for us in terms of a webinar series. And this is something that we have a small committee that we've been pulling things together. We have a meeting right after this webinar just to get everything together for the next webinar. So if you are interested in, we will continue to post things on Basecamp, and we do realize that a lot of you may not be on Basecamp, but we'll definitely make sure that we've been posting things on Facebook as well for our webinars to get more publicity and for people we just really want to make sure that we are reaching people outside of our network as well. So if you know of anyone else who may be interested in participating in any one of our webinars, we've been trying to do something monthly. This is part 2 of our webinar series. The very first one was facilitated by Deneen Thayer and Stephanie Keys, which was debunking the myths of racism. And this is part 2. So part 3 will be happening on April 1st, and we'll be getting information posted on Basecamp. And again, we will find some other ways to where we could get notification out to those people who are not on our Basecamp. But please just make sure you spread the word in terms of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, our Advocacy of Color Network. We are really trying to step outside the box and try to meet everyone to where we're trying to fill in the gaps that that we all have had in terms of what we did not learn in school. And I think this presentation is very clear that there's a lot of things that we have to be, in terms of history, that we have to relearn. And so are there any questions for Charlie?
No, but I think that this also gives us room and space to justify why we need alternative and additional room to do the real work we need. So I thank you for this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you 150%, Dr. Smith.
I also could not agree more, Dr. Smith.
Any other comments? There's a lot of thank you, Charlie, in the chat. So it seemed like this was very well received and appreciated, Charlie. So again, wonderful job. Thank you for giving us the knowledge that a lot of us did not know today. There's a lot of thank yous. So job well done.
Well, thank you all very much for your praise, and you're very welcome. This kind of like historical stuff is very much in my wheelhouse, and I love doing this kind of stuff. But outside of that, I and really all of us at the ACN feel this is just so deeply important because to kind of go back to Deneen's quote, you can't dismantle what you don't realize exists. You have to understand the basis for everything before you can tear down that rock.
Any other comments before we wrap up? Okay, well, thank you all so very much for joining us
I'm
today.
sorry, I have one question, if you said it or not. Where would this be posted that we can share it? This presentation?
First and foremost, it'll be posted on our Basecamp.
Okay,
Once we get everything down in terms of logistics and time and the Zoom link and things like that, it will be posted on Basecamp, but then we've also been posting on Facebook as well. So hopefully if people are not on Basecamp, hopefully if you're on Facebook, then you can get the information, and we'll just, if people can just make sure you spread the word by sending messages to other people, we'll have to do things old school that way. But those are Basecamp and Facebook are the two areas where we've been posting our webinars.
thank you.
You're so very welcome. Okay, well, I guess that concludes today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us, and please be on the lookout if you are on Basecamp. Just be on the lookout for part 3 of our ACN webinar. And again, we'll post it on Facebook. If you have any questions or anything that you would like to share with us, you can get in contact with us at the coalition. But like I said, this is being put on by the Advocacy of Color Network of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So if you know of anyone who is a person of color who would be interested in joining the group, please, well, don't call the coalition because we're still working from home, but you can send me an email and we'll get you signed up and get you on Basecamp as well. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording.